So the mitzvah of Emuna, let's try to think through this together. First mitzvah of the Torah, really the whole Torah is based on this. And in many ways it's the concentrated essence of all that we are. And if that's what it is, and it's especially a woman's role, then it pays to make an effort and try to think into this deeply. So let's try to do that. I think the way to do this is let's ask a few questions about Emuna and then see if we can think our way through them to build a picture. I think the most basic question about Emuna is really whether what we believe has evidence or proof. Can it be proven? Can it be known or not? That's the question. We relate to Hashem, and all that flows from that, Torah min hashamayim, the fact that we're obliged, we need to be prepared to give our lives if necessary. It all stems from one fundamental aspect of faith, and that is that Hashem exists. The question is that knowable or not? Can we prove that? Can we know it or can we not? The problem is that if we can know that, then why do we call it faith? The word Emuna, when you translate that into English, or into American, translates as belief, right? The word Emuna means belief or faith. Would you agree? Anyone out there? The way the King James Bible translates Emuna is faith. And faith means something you believe that you do not know. Right? Belief means something you cannot know. That's what belief is. The fact that you're sitting in front of me is something that I know. To say I believe it is inappropriate. What's on the other side of that wall, I need to believe. That's something I can't know. So the English word belief means something that is not known, but you relate to it anyway. Is that correct? And that's why it's called blind faith, or blind belief, or a leap of faith. It's a commitment that you have to make where there's no real knowledge. And the question you have to ask as a Jew is whether that makes any sense. Why, if a thing cannot be known, should I believe in it? If you can establish clearly, if you can know that Hashem exists, we should have no place for the word faith. We should talk about getting the knowledge. It's going to be a long night, ladies. Can we have enough Emuna that things will be okay to switch off our phones for now? Can we do that? Let's try again. Let's try to concentrate on this. If we can know that Hashem exists, then we should talk about knowledge and seeking the knowledge and gaining the knowledge. We should have no place for a concept of faith, which is something that you do blindly. If, on the other hand, you cannot know that Hashem exists and you need to believe it, the question is, why should you? I'm not sure that's for me. This is something you have to decide to do with no evidence. Now, just because blindly you sort of emotionally make a connection, then why should you do that? And secondly, you couldn't argue about this. If somebody from another faith system... That's fine, I don't need it. That's fine. I need you to sit down and that's it. Thank you. Somebody from another system of belief argues with you. There's no way you could argue, because if this isn't logical, then what's to argue about? And a person could really believe anything. Somebody from a different religion could argue that their cause is correct, and if it's a matter of belief, which means something you choose to relate to personally, then there's no logical argument. Which really makes a nonsense of the whole thing. Because if two people believe two opposite things, and we say that's fine, you can believe what you want, I believe what I want, you're really saying there's nothing objective here at all. Is that clear? And in fact, we live in a world where the non-Jewish approach to this, in the Christian world around us, certainly, the approach to belief is something that is very personal. It's not based on logic or knowledge. I'll give you an example. I was traveling from London to South Africa on a long overnight flight. And I happened to be sitting next to a gentleman who told me that he's an Episcopalian charismatic preacher. Don't ask me what it is, but it's Christian, okay? So during the flight, he tried to convert me to Christianity. Right? He wanted me to become a Christian. He gave me lots of reasons why I ought to believe in Christianity. And one of them was he tried to convince me that the founder of Christianity was the Messiah, and he tried to give me reasons why I should be able to believe that. One of the things he said was that the founder of Christianity could well have been the Mashiach, because his father, Joseph, the carpenter from Bethlehem, was in fact descended from the house of David. You know that the 4 Gospels show how Joseph was descended from Yehuda and David, and we know the Mashiach has to be Ben David, and therefore that's a requirement. So all 4 of the Christian Gospels show you his descent from the house of David. And therefore, since his father was born from the house of David in Yehuda, therefore he qualifies to be the Mashiach. So I said to him, don't you as a Christian believe that his father had nothing to do with his birth? Right? Little problem, right? He said, faith has nothing to do with logic. And he wasn't being facetious. He meant that matters of faith are not amenable to logical analysis. Because faith is something that, our faith is so strong, he said to me, that it transcends logic. In Judaism, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. We'll have to examine where is the opening for some sort of an attachment without knowledge, without proof. It has to be discussed. But we begin with a solid investigation and critical thinking. And you'll see that the world around us is very much oriented in that way. For example, very powerful subject, very popular subject today is the debate between science and religion, right? Science and religion debates. When you look at those debates, you'll often find that the parties to the debate are very well qualified scientifically, and they have no religious knowledge at all, right? A famous weekly news magazine a few years ago ran a debate between a very famous geneticist, who's a very devoutly believing Protestant Christian, and a very, very violently atheistic scientist who's a biologist, an evolutionist. Both these men are among the world's most highly qualified experts in their scientific field. Neither one has any religious knowledge. How do you begin to debate a subject at international level when you have no knowledge of the subject? No training in it, no formal education? The answer is that in their mind, religion is a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's something you sort of commit yourself to. It's not something you have to study. Not something you have to know. You couldn't study it because it's just a personal commitment. I'll give you an extreme example. Some of you may be familiar with Neve Yerushalayim, right? So that's Rabbi Refson, who runs this very acerbic Englishman with a very dry, acid sense of humor. And he was part of a debate a number of years ago on the subject of science and religion. And the first speaker was a very atheistic astrophysicist, unfortunately Jewish. But he began the debate. And he began like this: ladies and gentlemen, I don't know much about religion. First of all, can you imagine beginning a debate like that? You're now going to debate at a Nobel Prize winning international level. You're going to debate a subject, and your first statement is, you really don't know about the subject. I mean, would that be acceptable in any other discipline? Anyway, I don't know much about religion, but I think it can be summed up as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And on the basis of that assumption, he gave his talk. Rabbi Refson was the next speaker. He said, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know much about astrophysics, but I think it can be summed up as twinkle, twinkle, little star. So, you know, if you're going to talk about a subject and make nonsense of it and trivialize it because you know nothing about it, that's ridiculous. And therefore, let's get the question clear. Hashem's existence, is that something that's very important? Young people ask this question all the time. In the world of Kiruv, in the so-called religious world, children ask these questions. You know, what's the evidence? What's the proof? And the question we have to ask is, can you know that Hashem exists and that He gave us the Torah? Can you know that, or can you not know it? Either you know it, then we have no place for faith. And if you cannot know it, really, why should you believe it? Is the question clear? Anyone? Let's try to define a Jewish answer to this. The Jewish answer is that this can be known. This is an object of knowledge. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah leida, sheyeh sham. It says the Rambam, it's a mitzvah to know that Hashem exists. Right? We don't talk about blind belief, leaps of faith. We talk about our knowledge, and it's a mitzvah to know it. Well, if that's true, we have two questions. One is, how do you get the knowledge? I want the knowledge. How do you seek the knowledge of Hashem's existence? How do you find it? And secondly, why talk about faith? Those are the two questions. So let's talk about them. The first one we won't have time to go into fully this evening. I'd rather spend time on the second one more. But just to point a direction. How do we know that Hashem exists? What's the proof? What's the evidence? The answer is, we have two lines of thinking that lead us to that conclusion. One is Matan Torah, the fact that Hashem appeared and we met Him personally, and He gave us the Torah, and we can rely on the transmission of that event that has been brought down to us through history. And the second is philosophical and scientific investigation of the world around us, in that order of importance. But before we go into these at all, let me point out to you that when we talk about proof or knowledge, we're not talking about absolute knowledge. We do not mean that knowledge of Hashem's existence can ever be obtained at an absolute level. And the reason is because the human mind is not capable of absolute knowledge. It's not because there's any deficiency in the evidence, but because our minds are not capable of absolute knowledge. The human being, you wouldn't have free will if you could know things absolutely. There's nothing that you can know with absolute clarity. And even what you can know has different levels of reliability. But you can know nothing absolutely. Let me give you a simple example. Are you awake right now? I mean, those of you who are. Are you awake right now? Okay. Are you sure? Okay. Are you absolutely sure you're awake? No? Because you may be home in bed dreaming that you're listening to an amazing talk on Emuna at Ornava, and you're dreaming. When you dream, you think you're awake. That's why you can go through such ecstasy or such terror in a dream. Right? When you're dreaming, you think you're awake. You don't know you're sleeping. If you knew you were sleeping, you'd be going through some sort of terror. It'd be wonderful. It's like a free horror movie. People pay money for that. It'd be no problem. When you're dreaming, you think you're awake. So how can you be sure you're awake now? Maybe you're dreaming. I mean, this shouldn't bother you, ladies. If this bothers you, you need therapy. But it's an illustration of the fact that the human mind is not capable of a level of absolute knowledge. We cannot know anything absolutely. And therefore, when we claim... Can we switch off this noise? Is it possible? Can we switch it off? Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. When we claim that we can know that Hashem exists, we do not mean at an absolute level. We mean that there's evidence that's good enough. Just punch it. Thank you, that's good. Thank you. We mean that the evidence is as good as other areas of your life. When you do anything else in life, you have evidence. You never have absolute knowledge. When you trust a surgeon, when you fly in a plane, when you do something really dangerous like get married, whatever it is that you do, you're always basing your decision on a certain level of adequate evidence. It may be 80%, 85%, 90%, 95%, never 100%. There's nothing that you can ever know 100%. Some things are more secure, like mathematical and engineering things. Even then, in philosophy of science, the teaching is that you cannot know these things absolutely. The Ramban says in his commentary, one of his Perushim, the Ramban says that the Torah knowledge I'm going to share with you, do not bend yourself, don't try to squeeze yourself through the eye of a needle to argue with me, because what I'm saying is not 100%. You cannot rely on it completely. And he goes so far as to say that when it comes to establishing Torah truths, we don't even have the same clarity that we have in mathematics or engineering. That's what he says. Don't panic. It doesn't mean the evidence is not good enough. It is. But it's not absolute. And therefore, when we talk about knowledge of Hashem's existence, we're asking, is there adequate evidence? When somebody says to me, I want you to prove to me that Hashem exists, and he means 100%, when in the rest of his life he's prepared to accept 85% or 95%, I can't deal with a person like that. I can't meet that standard. But when a person realizes that in the rest of his life, the evidence that he has is 95% in certain areas, and he wants Torah to come up to that standard, I can deal with that. I can provide him such evidence. Is this clear? Yes. So we're not talking about absolute knowledge. We're talking about, is there good enough evidence? And if the evidence is good enough in any area of your life to predicate action, and you live by that and you do it, then we demand at least as good evidence in Torah. And if the evidence amounts to that, and by the way, I think people who claim proof are mistaken. I think they're wrong. When they run seminars in the Kiruv world, and they advertise, they say, come to our seminar, you'll walk in on Friday afternoon as a skeptical, cynical atheist, and you'll walk out Sunday night as a zombied out, fanatical, religious. I think that's a mistake. Because they offer people proof, and they do not come up to that standard. And people who are skeptical and critical thinkers are disappointed by that. They should not be advertising proof, they should be advertising evidence. Because the evidence is richly good enough. And people who are honest intellectually will grapple with the evidence and find that it's very compelling. But we're not talking about proof, and particularly not in a post-prophetic generation. We don't have Nevuah, we don't have Nissim, we don't have direct experience. All our knowledge is indirect. We don't go to the Beis HaMikdash and see 10 Nissim happening all the time. We don't have Nevi'im who give us a direct message. The Rambam says if you heard a Navi speak, you actually experienced what he was saying. We don't have that. Right? So we don't have any direct contact, and therefore our evidence that we can amass is all of an indirect sort. But it's compelling and it's good enough. So with that background, what is the evidence? And again, we don't have time to work through it fully, but are there two lines of thinking? One line is that we met Hashem personally. That's by far the most important, right? We met Him and it was a unique experience. Take one example, again, just to point a direction. The claim that Hashem appeared at Matan Torah is utterly unlike. Do you know that there's in the history of the humankind, there's never been a claim besides ours that Hashem appeared to more than one person at a time. Amazing thing. I'm not talking about miracles, I'm talking about a divine revelation, right? Wherever you look throughout the history of mankind, you will never find, it's a verse in the Torah. The Torah says, has there ever been a people taken out of another people like Hashem took you out of Mitzrayim? Or hanishma kamohu? Has there ever been purported to be such a thing? That means in the history of mankind, with all its liars and charlatans and false messiahs, nobody's had the chutzpah to even pretend that there was one witness to his revelation. Christianity begins with Paul's famous vision on the Damascus Road. So Paul came into the Jews and he said to them, God spoke to me. And the Jews said, and who was with you during this revelation? We had millions of people. He said, it was private. They're not good enough for us. Muhammad came out of his tent and he said, Allah appeared to him and dictated the Quran. And the Jews said, and who witnessed this revelation? No, it's my own private experience. Not good enough for us. And wherever you examine mankind, you'll find the same thing. If you go to Utah, interesting place for ladies. But in Utah, there's a religion. There's a religion in Utah founded by one man. He had a dream. He woke up in the morning. He told people his revelation. And hundreds of thousands of people follow that religion. That wouldn't be good enough for us. We're the only claim in the history of the world that 3.6 or 7.2 million people, if you count the Erev Rav, millions of people witnessed the same thing exactly and transmitted that story. It's not proof, of course, but it's a very interesting claim. But what bothers most people in our generation is, can we rely on the transmission? I mean, it's been who knows how many thousands of generations, each one telling the next the story. I mean, is there any possibility they would be reliable? If you whisper something in her ear and she whispers it in hers, by the time it gets down to there, it will have nothing to do with the original message. You can show that easily. We're talking about countless generations through the mists of time. Is there any possibility that the message will have got transmitted accurately? Almost zero. And you must have heard this claim. They say to you, well, it was probably a small band of nomads in the desert, wandering through the desert. They were probably eating, psychedelic mushrooms. And they had these visions. And that sort of became a religion. And through the mists of time, it got embellished. And now we have what's called Torah. You've heard that claim? You have to analyze that very carefully. That's a ridiculous claim. And the reason is as follows. Do you know how many generations there have been between Sinai and us? If we say, let's call it 3,200 years, a round number, and we call one generation 40 years, enough time for parents to tell their children, even to tell their grandchildren, which is a mitzvah. How many generations of 40 fit into 3,200? 80 generations, that's all. 80 generations, and we know who they were. The Rambam, in his introduction to the Mishnah, lists every one. He lists the leader of each generation. We know exactly who they were. We have the original writings. And when I say writings, I don't mean their writings, I mean their texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, go back more than 2,000 years. The same parchment. My friend Rabbi told me he took his children in Yerushalayim to see it. His 10-year-old son climbed up on a box. He looked into the glass case and he started reading a scroll of Yeshaya, more than 2,000 years old, word for word, what he learned in school. He said, Abba, we learned this 10 days ago in school. He read. Rabbi said the real miracle is that the kid remembers what he learned 10 days ago in school. Yeah. But I mean, here's a child in the modern age reading a scroll of Yeshaya, word for word, the same one that we have today. So you're talking about a very short chain. If you took from you, probably down to you, maybe one more row, you'd be able to see it all. You're handing one hand to another through 80 stages. And we have the original writings of each stage, and they're exactly the same. You're talking about Jews from Yemen and Tunis and Poland, and with exactly the same Torah, and exactly the same story, every Pesach Seder, in exactly the same. The difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Sefer Torah, who've been separated for thousands of years, is one letter. The word dakad, you spell it with an aleph or a hey. Not bad for 3,200 years. So when they tell you, well, there's this vague, embellished story that sort of, got put together, what are you talking about? You're talking about historical reference of incredibly accurate corroboration throughout all space and time, all Jews on earth agreeing about first of all, can you imagine all Jews agreeing about anything? If that isn't miraculous, I don't know what is. Sinai's nothing compared to that. That's an amazingly accurately corroborated story, wending its way through history. And the Kuzari examines that. The Kuzari, you should look it up. Amazing. The Kuzari says, how could this have been forged? Who could have foisted on a unanimous voice of a generation that we were told by our parents something that never happened? So that's one of the things to look at in terms of the transmission. And then there's another area, again, which we can't go into now, and that is scientific investigation. Does the world appear to be a random, chaotic... I'm talking about the human world. The human world is certainly a chaotic and random place, unfortunately. I'm talking about the natural world. Is the natural world incredibly concise and complex and with incredibly refined tolerances? Or is it a sort of a shapeless goo with no definition? And the more you examine that, the more you come to feel it's very difficult to suggest that this thing produced itself. And the more you get that clear, the more it suggests that intelligence produced this. Notice, by the way, this is less reliable than the Torah story, this philosophical investigation, and it's also very indirect. Because philosophical investigation never brings you in direct contact with Hashem. Right? I mean, just to give an illustration, or Simcha Wasserman used to put it like this, the classic argument is called the argument from design. Right? You know that argument? If you're walking in the desert and you stumble over one of these, right? Find one of these. And what would you, lying on the desert floor, what would you immediately know? Someone's been here. And if I said, well, no, it's the action of the sand and the wind and sort of rain and natural, you would not accept that. The natural world we live in, any detail is far more complex than this. That's called the argument from design. Something complex and designed has a designer. But notice that it's an argument by exclusion. That means it's very hard to suggest that it happened by itself. So, in mathematics, there's only two forms of proof. Derivation, you have a principle, and you build it in complexity till you arrive at your conclusion. Or exclusion. A or B must be true. I cannot prove A, but I can disprove B. That's a rigorous proof that A is true. All our proofs of Hashem are like that. Right? Does the world explain itself? Can you explain the world in its own terms, its complexity? No. Therefore, something else. And when you prove a thing by derivation, you not only end up knowing it, you end up understanding it because you built it. When you prove a thing by exclusion, you end up knowing what it is, you end up knowing that it's true, you have no idea what it means because you only proved it by exclusion. When you examine the world and you come to the conclusion that it couldn't have done itself, something else must have done it. But what that thing is, for that you need Torah. And perhaps that's an opening to understand why they think in the non-Jewish world that faith is blind and requires a leap. So let's summarize what we said up to this point. If someone says to you, what's the evidence that Hashem exists? One, we met him at Matan Torah, giving of the Torah at Sinai, and the transmission of that story is an incredibly corroborated story that's a very thought-provoking beginning. And secondly, there's investigation of the world around us that is very fruitful and productive and a valid way of approaching this. But let's turn our attention to, I think, what's more important, and especially with special importance to what a woman is and what women are meant to bring to this discussion. If we can get this knowledge, if we can get the evidence, why do we call it faith? Stay with me, it's worth understanding deeply. Why do we call it Emuna? Emuna means belief, blind belief, right? And we're talking here about getting a certain amount of knowledge. And the answer is this. They mistranslate Emuna. The non-Jewish world translates it as faith or belief, and a leap of faith and blind belief, because that's what it means to them. But that's not the right translation. The right translation of Emunah means loyalty. It doesn't mean faith. It means faithfulness. Look in the Torah, wherever the word Emunah is used, you'll find it means faithful. For example, Moshe Rabbeinu holds his hands up in the battle against Amalek. You remember that? And when he holds his hands up, we win the battle. When they drop, we lose. And the Torah says, V'hayu yadav Emunah ad Bahashem. And his hands were faith? No. His hands were faithful. They stayed put. Emunah is ne'eman. The right translation of Emunah means, are you loyal to what you know? It doesn't mean you believe blindly and leap off cliffs and be born again because you feel like it. It means, are you loyal? When something's clear to you, can you walk the walk? Are you committed to that? Can you stay attached to the thing? Are you faithful to what you know? That's a completely different thing. And therefore the Jewish approach, authentic Jewish approach, it has nothing to do with blind belief. It has to do with an attachment to what you know. First, you need the clarity. Does this thing make sense? Is there evidence for it? Is our practice, is it founded on solid foundations? Does it make sense? Is it logical, historical verification? Okay, now that you have that, are you going to live this? Or are you simply going to know it and then ignore it? There's the work of the head, and there's the work of the heart. The work of the head is getting it clear. And by the way, that's why traditionally men study Gemara, is to try to clarify this dimension. In the Jewish people, the male dimension is supposed to be a dimension of clarification. But then you need the work of character. Character means now that you've got it clear, can you live up to it? Can you bring it down into the dimension of action? That's not so simple. Right? Let's think about this for a moment. All of this clumsy discussion that I'm trying to go through this evening, the Zohar puts in 4 words. The Zohar says, Ihu emes, ve'ihi emuna. Amazing thing. The Zohar says, he is truth, and she is faith. Meaning, maleness is a clarification and an emes, and femaleness is an emunus, is an attachment to knowing how to bring this into practice, no matter how difficult it is. Let's think this through. It's an amazing thing. It's always like this. Maleness always means a beginning in clarity. We always refer to Hashem as male. He's the multipotential source of clear beginnings. The world is always feminine. All words for the earth are female. Adama, Eretz. Even the word Eretz, which doesn't have any female construction really, is a feminine word. Always the bringing into practice is feminine. When a child is conceived, what does a father give? Half a genetic code, that's all. Just a moment of coding of genetic instruction. The rest is all the woman. Day after day of a pregnancy. You can't take a day off a pregnancy. You might like to, but it doesn't work that way. One day after another, it gets more uncomfortable and more, and eventually it ends in difficulty and pain and danger. I don't mean to put you off, ladies. It's a wonderful mitzvah. You need to have children. It's fine. But it's a long, drawn-out process of construction, and that brings birth to the world. 2 opposite dimensions. The male dimension is a giving of a clear instruction. It's an inspired beginning. That's all it is. The female dimension is a long, drawn-out construction with difficulty that brings the practical. And you have to have emunus. You have to have emunah. You have to stay with it. The male dimension doesn't require an emunah. There's no staying power required. All it is a clarification of a beginning. It's a theory. It's a beginning. It's an inspiration. The female dimension is all the long walk to making it real. Completely opposite faculties. There's the clarity here, but it's a long way to bring it down to here. Let's think this through. The natural response to this is, well, if you have a thing clear, of course you're going to do it, aren't you? I mean, if you know a thing clearly, you're not going to ignore it, are you? Are you? If you know a thing, let's use the term loosely, absolutely clearly, and you see it with blinding clarity, and you know exactly what it is, aren't you then forced to live up to it? You're not going to ignore it, are you? The answer is yes, you are. Because the way human beings are constructed is you can have it clear up here and fail to bring it down here. You can know a thing as clear as you like and decide to betray it completely. And let me give you an example. Ever tried dieting? Let me explain to you how a diet works. I mean, I'm sure most of you, this is completely irrelevant, you can just ignore it. But if you've ever experienced this, you'll know. The way a diet works is first you get it clear. Very, very clear. The way you want to look, your image, it's like your relationships, your future, next summer on the Froome beach. It's like... But would you say that is a clear goal? And powerful and clear, and you know exactly what you have to do, and you know if you do it, you'll be successful? Clear. On the other hand, you've got this little chocolate wedge thing with a bit of cream and a cherry. It's ridiculous. It represents 10 seconds of pleasure during which you'll feel like an idiot and a failure. I mean, a 10-year-old wouldn't fall for that. I mean, that's ridiculous. How can you compare them? And a minute later, you're looking at a plate that is licked clean. It's like not... What happened? The thing wasn't clear enough? How do people do that? How do people do that? How do people get it so clear and see the vision and know exactly what they have to do, and a moment later, for some reason, they're completely ignored? How do people do that? When I was a junior intern in surgery, one day I got a patient in my ward who had Berger's disease. This disease is a genetic disease. People who have this have an exquisite sensitivity to the nicotine in cigarette smoke. What happens is they smoke, their blood vessels close down. First their fingers fall off, then their hands fall off. Okay? There's not one recorded case in a non-smoker. If they stop smoking, the disease arrests. They carry on smoking, the disease progresses. It's 100% clear. Okay. This man was a 45-year-old, highly intelligent engineer who came into our ward with a blue leg. Because the main artery supplying his leg had been closing down from the smoking. He already had 4 black toes that we had to cut off. And this man knew that if he carried on smoking, we have to cut his leg off. The man carried on smoking and we had to do an above-knee amputation. The next time I saw him was a year later, and I noticed them wheeling him down the hospital corridor in a wheelchair with no legs, smoking, on his way to losing an arm. So I mentioned this in New York to some doctors, and one of them told me he's got a friend who's a vascular surgeon, that a patient like this, when he lost his second arm, he had them put some wire on the wheelchair so he could still carry on smoking. Okay? So I just want to get that clear. Let's just get it clear. Man stands there with a cigarette and a leg. What are the options? Throw away the cigarette and live. Live, leg, man, husband, father, walk, leg, or 30 seconds of pleasure during which you'll feel the cold hand of death. But how could you get that wrong? How do we do that? The answer is it's a long way from here to here. It's a long way. There are many things come obstructed in between. You can know it clearly and see exactly what you have to do, and suddenly you find yourself at a completely different destination. This is male, and you need it very strongly. You need it very strongly. All of us need this strongly, and we all need this very strongly. If you're this without this, what are you worth? You're theoretical perfection. And if you're this without that, what are you? There's got to be a logic, it's got to be strong, it's got to be clear, it has to have a history. And Torah begins and ends with incredibly deep logical analysis and wisdom. But that's not enough. There's a female dimension, and that is bringing it down into the real and the world of practice. Let me give you an example of this. You know, there's a work called the Aruch. The Aruch is an ancient Talmudic dictionary. Rashi quotes it. And the Maharal in his Nesiva Emuna works this out in detail. You look it up yourself. The language is quite straightforward. And the Aruch tells the following story. This is a story of man and woman. Emes and Emuna. And it's called the story of the boar and the chulda. Boar is like a pit in the ground, and a chulda is like a weasel or a wildcat or some ferret or some sort of dangerous animal. And here's the story. And listen well, we won't have time this evening to analyze every detail, but look it up in the Maharal, he works through it. And it's very illuminating. It says there was a young woman going to visit her father. She was dressed in her best, and she had a jewelry on, and she looked best that she could. And she traveled to see her father. And on a journey to her father, she strayed into a wilderness and became lost. And in her wanderings through that wilderness, she fell into a bore. And she couldn't climb out, and she would have died there. There was no one around. And she began crying, but there happened to be a young man passing nearby. And he heard her cries, and he walked over to the edge of the bore, and he looked in, and he saw a young girl. He said to her, "Who are you?" She said her name. She was a Jewish girl. He was a Jewish boy. He was a Kohen, in fact. So he said to her, "Are you human?" He thought maybe she was one of the Twilight Zone creatures, the shadim in the desert. She said, "I'm human." He said, "Make a shvur, swear." We're talking maleness, okay? Maleness is clarification. So she made a shvur, she swore. By the way, how would that help? Isn't a liar going to swear that he's telling the truth? Because to make a shvur, you need to use Hashem's name. Only the forces of Kedusha can do that. So when she made a shvur using Hashem's name, he knew that she was for real. He said, "Fine, I believe you. If I save you, will you marry me?" So she said yes. So she didn't have much choice, did she? So the Aruch says, he lifted her out of the pit and he wanted to marry her on the spot. She said, "That's not decent. We don't behave that way. You go back to your town and prepare for the wedding. I will go back to my town and prepare for the wedding. When I've had enough time to prepare, you'll come and meet my parents. And then we'll get married." So he said, "Fine." Then they wanted to make an agreement that they would be committed to each other, what you call a vort. They wanted to make a commitment. But you need aiding for that. You need witnesses. There were no witnesses. It was a desert. So they decided to take the only two things that were present as aiding. The boar and a chulda that was running past. That's all there was. So they made a commitment to each other that we'll be loyal to each other, we'll get married, you'll come and fetch me, and our witnesses will be the boar and the chulda. She went back to her town and began preparing for the wedding. He went back to his town and forgot. Forgot. Are we talking male, female? Okay? In fact, the Aruch says, "Kevan she'ava mipaneh," which means as soon as she was out of sight. Forgot. Okay. Yeah, okay. This is like when you leave a man babysitting. You know, a woman can do 5 things at once. She's talking on the phone, she's cooking, she's looking after, and then there's a baby crying someplace, she knows about it. You leave a man babysitting, the child's life's in danger. No question. I mean, you know, there's no way he'll... Anyway, so he went back to his town and forgot. He then married another woman who became pregnant. She had a child. The child fell into a bore and died. Then she became pregnant again. She had a second child. The child was eaten by a chulda. So then she turned to her husband and she said, "This is bizarre. What does this mean?" And then he remembered the bore and the chulda. And he told her the story. She said, "Fine, if that's true, you divorce me and you go back and find the woman. You see, it's a woman who's waiting and a woman is teaching him. So the Rav says he divorced her, and he went back to the town that he remembered the girl said she came from all those years before. And he walked in, he went to see the girl's father, and he said, unfortunately, he can no longer see her. She lost her mind. The waiting has made her insane. Anyone goes close, she shreds their clothing. She's completely insane. He begged to be allowed to see her. He walked into the room where she was, and she started shredding at his clothing and behaving in insane fashion. He said to her, Boran Chulda. She recognized him, and she revealed to him that she'd been pretending to be insane so that no one else could marry her. Okay? They were married, they had a happy life together, they had children. What's being said here? Male, female. What's the female faculty? What is her head? Wanders into a desert, hopelessly lost. Has no idea where she's going. No sense of direction. No logical thing. Completely lost. But staying power, unbelievable. Commitment, unbelievable. Male, instant information, clarification, instant gratification. Results immediately. Staying power, zero. Nothing. Out of sight, out of mind, complete onto his next thing. No ability to remain attached. These are the two extremes. And therefore what's being taught here is you need a marriage in here. You need maleness and femaleness. If you're a woman, doesn't mean you have to be illogical. You need to know, you need to understand. Right? You have to understand proud awareness of what Torah means. And you have to know that it's founded on logic and principles of very well-founded and solid foundations. But that's not enough, because you can get as clear as you like. Unless you have the female faculty being able to bring it down and practice it and bring it into the world and make it real, what's it worth? And those are the two dimensions. Ihu emes, Emuna. And as we approach Matan Torah, that's what's needed. We need that inner marriage of abilities and talents and commitments. Our greatness is clarification, study, objectivity, critical thinking. In the Kiruv world, we bring people in. Young men, we bring them in. We don't tell them you've got to believe mindlessly and sit on a stone slab and meditate and eat rhubarb. We start them asking questions. You can afford to do that when you're dealing with the truth. And then there's the female faculty of going through what it takes, no matter how difficult, even when the evidence is against you. When a woman's in labor, it does not look like she's giving birth. The Rambam points this out. When a woman's in labor, it looks like two people are dying. Again, I don't mean to put you off, but that's the way it is. A difficult experience, it's a dangerous experience, and if you knew what the child was going through, you'd think there's no hope for a child. What a child goes through in labor. You know what happens to a child when a mother gives birth? The child in the womb, you know that the child's anatomy in the womb is exactly the opposite of a child that's born. You know that. When a child's in the womb, there's holes in its heart, the blood flows in the wrong direction, he has no lungs, they're squeezed up into little nubbins of tissue, there's no blood going to the lungs, it's all taken away by a major vessel that goes in the wrong direction. There's blood coming out of his umbilicus, he's got a different sort of blood, hemoglobin, completely, he's got all the conditions he needs to survive in the womb, and any of those would kill him immediately if you had them outside. And all the things that you need to survive, if you gave to the baby, you'd kill it. So he's got all sorts of reasons that he survives in the womb, and those are all death sentences when he's born. You know, the Gesher HaChaim has a wonderful marshal on this. The Gesher HaChaim talks about death and dying, and in the third Chelek, he talks about two twins in the womb, and one gets born, and the brother that remains behind begins to mourn for his brother, who surely must have died. He doesn't know that that's where life begins. So the child's in the womb, and as the child is born, the child's born into a world where he has no hope of survival. He's got 15 different reasons why he's going to die. I can tell you as a doctor, you hold that newborn child in your hands, it's terrible. First he goes blue, then he goes purple, he's making these gasping movements. He doesn't know where he's going to live. He's bleeding furiously. Do you know a newborn child has about this much blood? That's all. And he's pumping it furiously through his umbilical cord. There's no way he's going to survive. 2 or 3 minutes from now, there's 10 different reasons why he's going to die. And you stand there helplessly, and as you suddenly the umbilical cord clamps down like a steel cord, stops the bleeding. At the same moment, the holes in the heart close. At the same moment, the blood vessel that takes all the blood from the lungs closes down, the blood goes in the other direction. At the same moment, the lungs pop up and takes his first breath. And 3 minutes later, he's doing fine. That must have taken a good few million years in the trees by accident to get the orangutans to do that right. I mean, you know, that's absolutely amazing. So when a woman's in labor and she's going through an experience that looked like she's dying, you know, if a man had no idea how babies were born, and he stepped into a room unexpectedly and saw that going on, he'd need therapy. He'd call the police. I don't know what he'd do. I mean, and if he had to go through it, he'd need therapy the rest of his life. And there's no. And what happens is, in this impossibility, knowing that these difficulties, that every pain here is bringing birth to the world, of course it doesn't make labor a picnic. It doesn't make it fun. But when you have Emuna, when you know where this is leading, and you know that every pain is bringing a new life to the world, it's a whole different story. And that's why we talk about Chevlei Mashiach. When the Mashiach comes, it's going to be women. We all have to be that woman. Chevlei Mashiach. The Mashiach will be born in the birth pains of a labor process. Let me give you one final. Medrash says amazing. There's a Medrash called Beis HaMedrash. Amazing, long Medrash, written 1800 years ago. The Medrash says that before the Mashiach comes, the Bnei Yishmael would have a building on the Har HaBayis. You know this amazing thing? This was written before Islam became a religion. Chazal said that the Bnei Yishmael will have a building on the Har HaBayis. The Jewish people, the leaders of the Jews in that generation, whoever they may be, they go to the Arabs and they say to them, remove your building, we want to rebuild the temple. He said, no, it's our holy place. There's a moment of tension, and then the Bnei Yishmael turn to the Jews and they say, why fight? Let's make a divine test. Our Emuna is very strong, in case you hadn't noticed. There you have real Emuna. Let's make a Mizbech, an altar, and you Jews make a Mizbech. And you put an offering on yours, a korban, we'll put a korban on ours. And let's see if fire comes min hashamayim, for whose? Like in the days of Eliyahu on the Carmel. And the Jews agree. And then the Bnei Yishmael say to them, but we make a deal with you. If Hashem accepts ours, you join us. But if he accepts yours, we'll join you. And the Jews agree. And they build a Mizbech. And they put a korban on, a sacrifice. And the Jews put one on. And fire comes min hashamayim for the Arabs' offering. Emunah is when it doesn't look logical. A test of Emuna, when it's all logical and going the way you expect and all the evidence is there, what's the problem? Emuna means, and then the Bnei Yishmael turn to the Jews and they say, we had a deal. The Jews say, never. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. There's a terrible battle. Those who survive flee to the desert. And after 40 days of hiding in the desert, the Mashiach arrives. And then the Medrash goes on to show how he goes to Hebron and he wakes up the Avos and takes them out of their graves. A very, very beautiful Medrash. I once asked Rav Simcha Wasserman, will it be like that? And he said it will be exactly like that. Meaning, it will be a series of events where it does not look like, when a woman's in labor, it does not look like she's giving birth. It looks like a very bizarre and abnormal process in which she and definitely the child are not going to survive. And the difficulties of the process are what bring new life to the world. And that's a woman's faculty. Not only that, a woman who understands it deeply can laugh through that process. We say, "Vatischak b'yom acharon." Can you imagine that? She laughs at the day of death. We sing that on Friday night when the week transitions into Shabbos. Just like the week of history of 6,000 years will transition into 1,000th year of Shabbos. At that moment, it's a woman's time. And so we say in praise of Jewish women at that time, a woman who in her own flesh has been through that transition of what looks like a death process leading to a life process. That's what it means. Let me finish with a story. Unless you have any questions. Any questions? It's all clear.
Well,
Yes.
no, I'm not sure, but that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. Aren't there discrepancies in some of them?
No. We have some scrolls that are not part of Nach. There are some external stuff. There's even one or two Greek fragments. There are one or two Essene or, we have a Masoretic text, right, that has come down through history. There are one or two discrepant texts. There's some fragments of those. But the Dead Sea Scrolls have a fragment of every single book of Tanakh, except for Esther. Esther's the only piece they haven't found a fragment of. Yes?
Well, the difference of believing, even though the Ishmaelim will have sacrifice will have been accepted, but that is, you're saying it's based on...
It's a test.
I understand it's a test, but we're basing it on the pre-knowledge of before. In other words,
there's a message that warns you.
No, I understand.
When a woman's in labor, she knows this is leading to a birth. It's still difficult, but at least she knows where it's heading.
I understand that, but it's still, you're saying logically, we first have to use the logic, and then we have to join it together.
Of course, you have to have a knowledge of what's been before. Then when you get tested, this girl had a commitment. But years later, when he hadn't appeared, and it was very clear he was not coming, that didn't change anything. Because you go back to a moment of commitment. That's to start with an MS, and then you have to stay attached to that. Let me finish with a story. Here's a story. In 1942, an amazing story. In 1942, the Japanese, during the war, invaded the Philippines. In 1944, they left. But a series of very strange events continued in the Philippines. People were being shot to death in the jungle. 30 people died. Why? Because one Japanese soldier got left behind. His name was Lieutenant Onoda, and he got left behind accidentally, and Japanese instructions were to fight to the death, and he carried on his own war. One-man army. Everyone else had gone. He carried on fighting the enemy, and this went on for 30 years. 30 years. 30 years later, 1974, the Japanese decided to do so. It's getting difficult. The Filipinos were unhappy. They sent a Major Suzuki into the jungle and he found him. And he said to him, "Onoda, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm fighting the war. I'm a soldier. I was given instructions and I'm being loyal to my task." He said to him, "But you're being illogical. You're being ridiculous." He said, "A soldier's duty is not to be logical. A soldier's duty is to do what he was commanded to do and loyally carry out his duty. If every soldier starts thinking logically, you don't have an army." He said to him, "Do you know the war's over?" He said, "I'm not a fool, of course." "You know the war's over. You're being ridiculous. You're being completely logical." He said, "That's not my job." Talk about Emuna. He couldn't convince him to go home. Suzuki went back to Japan, and the Japanese high command came up with a plan. They found an elderly officer who had been present during the evacuation. They sent him back into the jungle with the original Japanese demobilization order to lay down weapons and go home. He found him, called him to attention in the jungle, and he read him the original order to lay down arms and go home. On order to hand over his gun, he went back to Japan. It's a very emotional story. The Filipinos called him a hero and bought him a new blue suit. He arrived at Tokyo airport. Thousands of people came to greet him. He left the pre-war Japan, hadn't seen his family for 30 years. He came back to a new modern... Anyway, a fascinating story. But imagine you standing in the jungle and you say, "Oh, no, let's go home." He says, "No, I'm carrying out my task." And you say to him, "But you're being illogical." And he says, "It's nothing to do with me." And you say, talk about Emuna. Talk about loyalty. But on the other hand, he's doing something wrong, isn't he? Something desperately wrong. I mean, he's killing people. So I told this story to a group of young high school students in London. And I said, "What was he doing wrong?" One young girl put up her hand and she said, "He had Emuna, but he did not have MS." Right. You need both. It has to be right what you do. Once what you're doing is right, then you plow through, no matter how difficult it is. Once you're bringing life to the world, and you know that's what you're doing, who cares about the pain and the difficulty? This is what's needed, you go through it. But without this, what are you worth? Attachment to something that is crazy. It's ridiculous. Nothing more dangerous. And having it clear, but not having the courage to act in the world. What are you worth? And therefore the Jewish people consists of these two elements. Ihu emes, ihu emuna. We have that depth of understanding. That first what has to come is understanding. It has to be there. It has to be clear. And we have a whole approach to Torah, which is depth of understanding. That's what it is. And then there's another requirement, and the deep character of the Jewish people that is instilled in every child by a Jewish mother has to be the strength of character, that when the knowledge is there, and we have a clarity about what it is and where we've come from, that we have the strength of character to be able to go through it. And then I would submit to you is the greatness of Jewish woman, that she can take those times of difficulty, and despite the difficulty, and perhaps even because of it, we can say, "Vatischak hayom ha'acharon." Thank you.